The first log was set in a curve on April 14, 1881, and by noon, 3 men had stopped their wagons on the rutted track that passed for Main Street in Eldridge, Kansas, to stare at what Tobias Kren was doing with a surveyor's chain and a sharpened stake driven into the center of a circle scratched into the prairie. By sundown, the owner of the general store, a man named Carswell who had been in Greenwood County since territorial days, we had walked the 400 yards from his shop to the building site and asked Tobias, point blank, whether he had lost his mind or simply never seen a proper house before. Tobias, who had spent 14 years as a cooper's apprentice and then journeyman in Stuttgart before crossing the Atlantic in 1873, looked at Carswell without expression and said, "I have seen proper houses. I have also seen what wind does to corners." The temperature that afternoon was 71 degrees Fahrenheit. The sky was the pale to scoured blue that central Kansas wears in early spring, and the wind, as it always did on the high plains, was blowing. 16 miles per hour from the southwest, steady and indifferent. Tobias had been measuring that wind for 11 months. He had a leather notebook filled with daily readings taken with a Robinson anemometer he had purchased from a scientific instruments dealer in Kansas City for $4.75. A sum that represented nearly a week's wages at the lumberyard in Emporia, where he had worked through his first American winter. The notebook recorded 334 consecutive days of wind observations, and on 297 of those days, the sustained wind speed had exceeded 10 miles per hour. On 41 of those days, gusts had exceeded 40. On 3 occasions, he had recorded gusts above 60 miles per hour, and on those days he had watched from the cellar of his boarding house as roof shingles sailed past like playing cards and a privy behind the feed store separated from its foundation and tumbled end over end into a wheat field. He had seen enough. He was going to build a round house. Not an octagon, those were fashionable back east, written up in pattern books and promoted by a phrenologist named Orson Fowler, who believed that 8-sided homes were healthier because they admitted more sunlight. Tobias had read Fowler's book. He thought the man was half right and entirely wrong about the reason. An octagon was better than a square, certainly. 8 walls presented less perpendicular surface area to a crosswind than 4, but an octagon still had corners, 8 of them, and every corner was a joint, and every joint was a weakness, and every weakness was an invitation. What the wind needed, what Tobias understood from years of shaping barrel staves into smooth continuous curves that could hold 200 liters of pressure without a single nail, was a shape that offered it nothing to grab. No flat face to push against, no corner to pry apart, no ridge where 2 planes met at an angle that created differential pressure. A circle, the same shape that held wine against oak for decades, the same geometry that let a barrel survive being rolled down a cobblestone ramp, dropped from a wagon, and stacked 3 high in a cellar. The strongest shape in nature, and the one that almost nobody in Greenwood County, Kansas, had ever considered building a house from. The foundation alone took 3 weeks and required a technique that none of the local men had ever seen. Tobias dug a circular trench 28 feet in diameter, 3 feet wide, and 4 feet deep, below the frost line, which he had determined through inquiry at the land office was approximately 30 inches in this part of Kansas. Though he added the extra depth as insurance against what he called, in his accented English, the winters that have not happened yet. Into this trench he laid limestone blocks that he hauled by wagon from a quarry 11 miles northeast near the Verdigris River, making the trip 14 times over the course of 9 days. Each load weighed approximately 1,800 pounds, and his 2 draft horses, a mismatched pair he had purchased at auction for $62 combined, Shu developed a visible lather on the uphill grades that he treated with a liniment of his own making. The limestone was set without mortar for the first 2 courses, dry stacked in a technique he said his grandfather had used in the Schwarzwald for building sheep enclosures that had stood for a century. Above the dry courses, he mixed a morite ophite of calcium oxide paste, quickite, mixed with sand from a creek bed at a ratio he specified as 1 part calcium to 3 parts sand, so measured by volume in a wooden bucket he had made himself. The foundation rose 18 inches above grade, forming a continuous, unbroken ring of stone with no corners, no joints perpendicular to the prevailing wind, and a wall thickness of 14 inches at the base. Carswell returned during the foundation work, this time accompanied by Rudolph Fendt, a farmer who owned 320 acres a mile south of town and who had built what was generally considered the finest house in Eldridge, a two-story frame structure with a proper parlor, glass windows shipped from St. Louis, and a cellar lined with brick. Fendt was 54 years old, originally from Western Virginia, and had survived 2 decades of Kansas weather through the method that everyone understood and trusted: heavy timber framing, tight joinery, and a willingness to rebuild what the wind tore apart. He walked around Tobias's foundation ring, stepped over the trench where the stone was being laid, and said, "You cannot frame a circle with dimensional lumber. It cannot be done. You will waste more wood trying to curve what God made straight than you would building 2 square houses, and you will end up with neither." Tobias, who was on his knees setting a limestone block and checking its level with a spirit level he carried in his coat pocket, did not stand up. He said, "I will not be using dimensional lumber for the walls. I will be using staves." Fendt asked what he meant. Tobias explained. The walls of his house would be constructed using the same principle as a barrel: vertical staves of white oak, each one 8 feet long, 6 inches wide, and 2 inches thick, shaped with a slight curve on a shaving horse using a draw knife. Tools he had brought from Stuttgart and which bore the marks of 14 years of daily use. Each stave would be beveled on both edges at a precise angle calculated from the circumference of the circle. For a 28-foot diameter, the interior circumference was approximately 87 feet and 11 inches, which meant he needed approximately 176 staves to complete the wall, each one angled at just over 2 degrees per edge, so that when pressed together they formed a continuous curve with no gaps. The staves would be held in compression by 3 iron bands, hoops, so exactly as on a barrel, positioned at 18 inches, 48 inches, and 78 inches above the foundation. The hoops were wrought iron, 2 inches wide and 3/8 of an inch thick, custom forged by a blacksmith in Emporia named Gus Holder, who charged Tobias $11.50 for the set and privately told his wife he was taking money from a lunatic. The total cost of the iron bands, including the rivets and tightening hardware, was $14.25. The wood for the staves cost $31, purchased as rough-sawn white oak planks from a sawmill on the Neosho River, 23 miles distant. Tobias spent 4 weeks shaping the staves by hand, working from dawn until he lost the light, producing an average of 6.3 finished staves per day. Each stave required approximately 45 minutes of draw knife work, followed by 20 minutes of edge beveling with a jointer plane, followed by a final fitting against a curved template he had cut from a piece of sheet tin bent to the exact radius of 14 feet. The template was his most important tool. Without it, the cumulative error of 176 individual angle cuts would have compounded into a wall that refused to close, a gap at the final stave, or worse, a bulge that would compromise the compression that gave the structure its strength. With the template, each stave was verified before it was set, and any deviation greater than 1/16 of an inch was corrected before the piece joined the wall. By June 1st, 1881, the wall was halfway up, and the structure was attracting attention from beyond Eldridge. A correspondent for the Eureka Herald, a weekly newspaper published in the county seat 14 miles south, rode up to see it and wrote a piece that appeared on June 9th under the headline, "A German Builds a Barrel to Live In." The article was not unkind, but it was not serious either. It described Tobias as an industrious foreigner of peculiar architectural convictions and noted that the structure, while undeniably novel, presents certain difficulties that even its builder may not have fully considered. Chief among them, the matter of fitting a door and windows into a wall that admits no straight lines. This was, in fact, the most common objection Tobias heard, and it was the one he enjoyed answering most, because the answer revealed the depth of his planning. A cooper, he explained to anyone who asked, and several people who did not, knows that a barrel must have a bunghole. A bunghole is cut into a curved surface without compromising the structural integrity of the vessel, because the surrounding wood compensates through the continuous distribution of compressive force along the curve. If you can cut a bunghole into a barrel that holds 200 liters of wine at pressure, you can cut a door into a wall that holds nothing but air. The door and the 2 windows were framed with doubled oak headers and sills. On each piece, steam bent to match the wall's curvature using a steam box Tobias constructed from an old water trough and a kettle. The steam bending took 3 days, and 2 of the header pieces cracked during the process and had to be remade, adding 4 additional days and $1.60 in material cost. But when the door frame was set into the wall, it fit so precisely that Tobias could not slide a piece of paper between the frame and the surrounding staves. The windows, each 24 inches wide and 36 inches tall, were fitted with glass purchased from Carswell's store, Tobias noting with dry amusement that Carswell was happy to sell materials to a lunatic at a cost of $2.15 per pane, $4.30 total. If you're finding this account of practical ingenuity as compelling as I do, I'd ask you to consider subscribing to this channel. These stories of forgotten builders and lost techniques don't surface on their own. They require research, verification, and a belief that the practical wisdom of people like Tobias Krenn deserves to be remembered. A subscription ensures that more of these accounts reach the people who value them. The roof presented the greatest engineering challenge and produced the most skepticism. Rudolf Fendt, who had by now visited the building site 5 times, each visit producing a new objection that Tobias noted with what might have been amusement, stood at the edge of the foundation on June 18th and said, "Even if the walls hold, you cannot put a roof on a circle. A roof needs a ridge. A ridge needs 2 planes. 2 planes need a rectangle beneath them. You have no rectangle, you have a barrel." Tobias said, "I am aware of what I have." The roof was a cone. 16 rafters, each one cut from a single piece of post oak, radiated from a central hub, a circular plate of white oak 18 inches in diameter and 4 inches thick, which Tobias had turned on a foot-powered lathe he had built from salvaged wagon parts. The rafters were joined to the hub with mortise and tenon joints, each tenon hand-cut with a tolerance that the Eureka Herald correspondent, who returned for a second visit, described as watchmaker's work applied to house framing. The rafters descended at a 30-degree pitch, steep enough to shed rain and hail, shallow enough to resist uplift from wind passing over the structure. This angle was not arbitrary. Tobias had calculated it from first principles he had learned not in a school of architecture, but in a cooperage, where the angle of a barrel head relative to the staves determines whether the head will hold under pressure or blow out. A barrel head set too flat flexes inward, set too steep, it resists internal pressure but becomes vulnerable to external force. The optimal angle in coopering was between 28 and 32 degrees, depending on the diameter of the vessel. For a house 28 feet across, 8 exposed not to internal pressure but to external wind, Tobias selected 30 degrees as the midpoint and calculated that the uplift force on the conical roof at a wind speed of 80 miles per hour would be approximately 22 pounds per square foot, a figure he arrived at through a formula he had copied from a German engineering text he had carried across the Atlantic in a leather satchel along with his draw knife and his spirit level. To resist this uplift, the rafters were not simply nailed to the top of the stave wall, they were notched into a continuous ring beam, a circular plate of oak 6 inches wide and 4 inches deep that sat atop the wall and was itself held in compression by the uppermost iron hoop band. The rafters were bolted through the ring beam with half-inch iron bolts, 16 in total, on each one tightened until the wood began to compress, a technique Tobias described as letting the iron argue with the oak until they agree. The roof sheathing was applied in concentric rings of thin oak planks, overlapping like fish scales, starting at the eave and working upward toward the hub. Each ring was nailed with cut nails at 4-inch intervals, and the overlaps were sealed with a mixture of pine tar and beeswax that Tobias cooked in an iron pot over an open fire, producing a smell that a neighbor later described as something between a ship and a church. Over the sheathing, he laid split cedar shingles, also in overlapping rings, secured with copper nails he had purchased at considerable expense, $3.40 per pound, and he used 6 pounds, because copper would not rust and weaken over time the way iron nails would. The total cost of the roof, including the central hub, the 16 rafters, the ring beam, the bolts, the sheathing, the tar mixture, and the cedar shingles and the copper nails was $47.80. This brought the total construction cost of the house, excluding Tobias's labor, to $109.85, roughly $18 more than a conventional frame house of the same interior square footage, which Tobias calculated at approximately 615 square feet. Rudolph Fent's house, by comparison, had cost an estimated $340 to build, though it was admittedly larger and had 2 stories. The comparison Tobias preferred was not with Fent's house, but with the standard claim shanty that most settlers built. A single-room frame box, 14 by 16 feet, with 224 square feet of interior space and a materials cost of approximately $45. His roundhouse delivered 2.75 times the floor area for 2.44 times the cost. A better ratio, he pointed out, though nobody asked him for the arithmetic. The house was completed on July 22, 1881, and Tobias moved in with his possessions. A straw tick mattress, so a cast iron stove he positioned at the exact center of the circular floor, a table and 2 chairs, his tool chest, the leather satchel of books, and a framed tintype of his parents that he hung on the curving interior wall, using a nail he drove at a slight upward angle to compensate for the convex surface. The stove placement was deliberate. In a rectangular room, a near central stove heats unevenly. The corners receive less radiant warmth and develop cold spots where moisture condenses and frost forms on the interior walls in winter. In a circle, every point on the wall is equidistant from the center. Radiant heat from the stove reached every portion of the interior wall simultaneously and at equal intensity. See a principle Tobias demonstrated to a visiting schoolteacher named Clara Osborne by placing 4 candles at equal distances from the stove and timing how long each took to soften. All 4 began to slump within 90 seconds of each other, a variation he attributed to minor differences in the candles themselves rather than any inequality in heat distribution. Clara Osborne, who was 31 years old and had come to Greenwood County from Massachusetts to teach at a subscription school 3 miles north of Eldridge, was the first person to enter the completed house and offer an assessment that was neither dismissal nor mockery. She walked the interior perimeter slowly, trailing her hand along the smooth curve of the stave wall, and said, "It feels like being inside a musical instrument." Tobias said nothing, but he offered her coffee, which she accepted. For the summer passed without incident. The house performed unremarkably in fair weather, which was precisely what Tobias expected. The advantages of the design were not visible under calm conditions. A barrel does not demonstrate its superiority over a box when both are sitting on a shelf. The demonstration requires force. In Kansas, in the 1880s, force was not a question of whether, but when. The first significant test came on September 3, 1881, when a line of thunderstorms crossed Greenwood County from the southwest, producing sustained winds of approximately 55 miles per hour and hail measured at 3/4 of an inch in diameter. The storms arrived at 4:15 in the afternoon, and by 4:40, the hail had stripped the leaves from every tree within sight of Tobias's property. 3 buildings in Eldridge lost roof shingles, but Carswell's store lost a section of tin roofing that peeled back from the southwest corner and folded over itself like a page in a book. Rudolph Fent's house, which faced broadside to the southwest wind, lost 4 window panes on the windward side, the glass driven inward by pressure differential and scattered across his wife's parlor floor, where it mixed with the rain that followed the hail and ruined a braided rug that had come from Virginia with the family in 1862. Tobias's house lost nothing. The wind, encountering the curved wall, split around it the way river current splits around a bridge piling, accelerating slightly along the flanks, creating a brief area of low pressure on the leeward side, but finding no flat surface to push against and no corner to leverage. The conical roof, presenting a smooth, angled surface in every direction, shed the hail and rain without catching the wind underneath. The cedar shingles, overlapping in their concentric rings, are channeled water downward in smooth sheets. Not a single shingle lifted. Not a drop entered the interior. The cast iron stove, which Tobias had lit that morning against a chill that dropped the temperature to 52 degrees before the storm, continued to burn steadily throughout. When the storm passed at 5:30, Tobias opened his door, the only flat surface on the entire structure and the element he considered most vulnerable, and found it undamaged, its frame tight, its hinges unstressed. When he walked into town the next morning to buy flour and found Carswell on his roof with a hammer and a mouthful of nails, attempting to re-secure the tin sheeting. Tobias offered to help. Carswell accepted. Neither man mentioned the difference in their building's performance, but Carswell, from his position on the roof, could see the roundhouse clearly, sitting undisturbed on its rise a quarter-mile north, and his expression, or according to a letter Clara Osborne wrote to her sister in Massachusetts that week, was that of a man reconsidering a settled opinion. The autumn brought 3 more significant wind events, October 1st, October 19th, and November 7th, each producing gusts above 50 miles per hour, and each leaving Tobias's house untouched while extracting small tolls from the rectangular buildings in and around Eldridge. A claim shanty belonging to a family named Drucker, 2 miles east, unlost its entire roof on October 19th. The Druckers spent 3 days in the cellar of a neighbor's house, while the father, Heinrich Drucker, rebuilt with salvaged lumber. The replacement roof, like the original, was a simple gable, 2 flat planes meeting at a ridge, presenting a broad, flat surface to any wind that came from the side. Tobias, who passed the Drucker property on his way to the sawmill, was stopped and offered to help, and also to explain why the roof had failed and how a modified design might resist future storms. Heinrich Drucker, who was 38 years old and had emigrated from Saxony 4 years earlier, listened politely and then said, "I cannot build a round roof on a square house." Tobias said, "Then build a round house." Drucker looked at him for a long moment and then returned to nailing his gable rafters. This was the nature of the problem, and Tobias understood it even if it frustrated him. The round house worked. The round house had proven itself in 4 successive storms. The mathematics were not ambiguous. A cylinder presents roughly 68% less wind resistance than a flat wall of equivalent height and width, because the airflow separates smoothly around the curved surface rather than creating a high-pressure zone on the windward face and a turbulent, below-pressure zone on the leeward face that together generate the forces that push walls inward, pull roofs upward, and twist corners apart. This was not theory. This was fluid dynamics applied to architecture, and it was as demonstrable as gravity. But it required people to build in a way they had never seen, using techniques they did not possess, producing a home that looked unlike any home they recognized. And on the frontier, where survival depended on rapid construction with limited materials and skills, convention was not merely preference, it was infrastructure. Every man in Greenwood County knew how to frame a rectangle. They knew the angles, the joints, the sequence. They could raise a wall in a day with 2 helpers and a pile of dimensional lumber. They could not bend staves. They did not own draw knives. They had never heard of a ring beam or a compression hoop. And the idea of calculating wind resistance from a German engineering text was as foreign as the language it was printed in. Tobias was right, and being right was not enough. If you're watching this and thinking that stories like this one deserve to be told, accounts of practical brilliance overlooked because it didn't fit the pattern, I'd be grateful if you take a moment to like this video and share it. The algorithm, much like the frontier, rewards what's conventional, when it takes deliberate effort to surface what's unusual. Your engagement is that effort, and it matters more than you might think. The winter of 1881 to 1882 was cold, but not exceptional. Tobias recorded a minimum temperature of -11 degrees Fahrenheit on January 14th, with sustained winds of 25 miles per hour that produced a wind chill he estimated, using tables from his engineering text, at approximately -40. Inside the roundhouse, with the central stove burning a mix of hedgewood and coal, the temperature held at 58 degrees at the wall and 67 degrees at the center, a gradient he found acceptable and which demonstrated the even heat distribution of the circular plan. He burned approximately 30% less fuel than his nearest neighbor, a calculation he based on comparing his own consumption, 4.2 cords of wood and 1,100 pounds of coal over the winter, with the reported consumption of Fent, who burned 7 cords of wood and 1,800 pounds of coal to heat a house with only 40% more floor area. The round house's thermal efficiency came from three factors: the absence of corners where cold air pooled and convective loops developed, the reduced surface area to volume ratio of a cylinder compared to a rectangular prism of equivalent floor area, approximately 12% less exterior wall surface, meaning 12% less area through which heat could escape, and the compression of the stave walls, which had tightened as the oak dried through the summer and fall, closing the hairline gaps between staves to less than 1/32 of an inch without the need for chinking or caulking. The iron hoops, contracting in the cold, actually tightened the walls further, a self-sealing mechanism that Tobias had predicted, but which still pleased him when he confirmed it by running a feather along the interior wall joints on the coldest nights and detecting no draft. Spring arrived, and summer, and another autumn, and another winter. The house stood. It stood through the blizzard of January 1883, which killed an estimated 50 cattle in Greenwood County and forced the closure of the Eureka to Eldridge Road for 6 days. It stood through a windstorm on March 9, 1883, that overturned a freight wagon on the road south of town and deposited its cargo, 480 pounds of fencing wire, in a tangled mass across a wheat field. It stood through the summer storms of 1883 and 1884, through straight-line winds and hail, and the low, grinding roar that settlers learned to dread because it meant the air itself was rotating. On each occasion, Tobias recorded the conditions in his leather notebook, or adding to a data set that grew more comprehensive with each passing season. By the spring of 1884, he had over 1,100 daily entries: wind speed, wind direction, temperature, precipitation type and amount, and the condition of his house after each significant weather event. The entry for every storm was the same: no damage. Meanwhile, the cumulative toll on the rectangular buildings of Eldridge was significant. Carswell had replaced his store roof twice. Arfent had rebuilt his front porch 3 times, each time reinforcing the corner posts with additional bracing that made the structure stronger but also more rigid. And rigidity, as Tobias could have explained and perhaps did, was the enemy of survival in wind country. A rigid structure absorbs force until it exceeds the structure's breaking point, at which moment it fails catastrophically. A flexible structure, or better still, a curved structure that deflects force rather than absorbing or resisting it, distributes the load continuously and never reaches the critical threshold. This is why trees bend and fence posts snap. This is why willow withstands what oak does not. This is why a barrel survives what a box cannot. Then came June 12, 1884. The morning began still and warm, 78 degrees at 7 a.m., which was unusual for that hour, and which Tobias noted in his book with an asterisk, on his personal notation for conditions he considered worth watching. By noon, the temperature had reached 94 degrees, and the southwestern horizon had developed the bruised yellow-green color that every Kansas settler recognized and feared. Tobias had been watching the sky since mid-morning. By 1 p.m., he had moved his tool chest, his books, and the tintype of his parents into the root cellar he had dug beneath the house, accessible through a trapdoor in the center of the floor, directly beneath the stove, which he moved aside using an iron lever he kept for this purpose. At 2:15 p.m., the air went dead. The wind, which had been gusting to 20 miles per hour from the south, simply stopped. The silence was sudden and total. Tobias had experienced this once before, in June 1882, and it had preceded a thunderstorm that produced a funnel cloud visible from town, but which had not touched down. This time, he did not think they would be so fortunate. At 2:40 p.m., the southwestern sky turned black from the ground to approximately 30 degrees above the horizon. The darkness was not cloud cover, it was debris. Dirt, grass, fence posts, and fragments of structures already destroyed were being carried in a rotating column of air that, based on the width of the debris field visible from Eldridge, Tobias estimated at between 300 and 400 yards across. It was moving northeast at approximately 30 miles per hour, and it was aimed, with the blind geometric inevitability that defines tornadic paths, directly at the eastern edge of Eldridge. Tobias did not go to his cellar. He knew he should. every instinct and every piece of advice he had ever received told him to get underground and stay there. But he was a man who had spent 3 years building a structure based on a specific theory of wind resistance, and the theory was about to be tested in the most extreme conditions possible, and he could not bring himself to hide from the answer. He stood at his south-facing window, the glass pane vibrating in its frame like a tuning fork, and watched. The tornado struck the eastern edge of Eldridge at approximately 2:52 p.m. The first structure in its path was a hay barn belonging to a man named Josiah Moore, 800 yards southeast of Tobias's property. The barn was a standard rectangular frame, 30 feet by 50 feet, with board and batten walls and a gambrel roof. It existed for approximately 4 seconds after the leading edge of the vortex reached it. The walls did not collapse inward, they exploded outward, blown apart by the pressure differential between the compressed air outside the windward wall and the sudden vacuum created on the leeward side. The roof lifted as a single piece, rose approximately 60 feet, and then disintegrated into individual boards that radiated outward like shrapnel. One of those boards, an 8-foot length of pine, was later found embedded 14 inches deep in the trunk of a cottonwood tree 200 yards north, driven with a force that Tobias later calculated based on the density of cottonwood and the cross-section of the board at approximately 1,200 pounds per square inch at the moment of impact. The tornado moved northeast. It struck the Drucker claim shanty, the one Heinrich Drucker had rebuilt with a new gable roof after the October 1881 storm. This time, there was nothing to rebuild. The house was erased. The foundation stones were scattered. The cellar, which the Drucker family had mercifully reached in time, was open to the sky. Heinrich Drucker, his wife Martha, and their 3 children, ages 7, 5, and 2, crouched in that cellar as the air above them carried away everything they owned. The baby's cradle was found 4 days later in a creek bed 6 miles northeast. It was intact, nothing else was. The tornado continued northeast, crossing the road that led to Fent's property. Fent's house, the finest in Eldridge, stood broadside to the storm's path. The 2-story frame structure, with its glass windows from St. Louis and its Virginia parlor, and its corner posts that Fent had reinforced with additional bracing after every previous storm, received the full force of the vortex at approximately 2:55 p.m. The reinforced corner posts, the ones that made the structure more rigid, more resistant, more unyielding, did exactly what rigid structures do when the force exceeds their capacity. They held for a fraction of a second longer than unreinforced corners would have, and then they failed all at once, and the failure was total. The first story collapsed inward. The second story, momentarily unsupported, dropped vertically and then was caught by the rotational wind and thrown. The entire second story, as a mostly intact unit, approximately 30 yards north, where it struck the ground and broke apart. Fent and his wife, Margaret, were in the cellar. They survived. Their house did not, where the tornado's path carried it 140 yards south of Tobias Kren's round house. At that distance, the wind speed was later estimated, based on damage patterns to structures and vegetation along the path's edge, at between 90 and 120 miles per hour. Not the full fury of the vortex, which may have exceeded 200 miles per hour at its center, but far beyond what any conventional structure in its path had withstood. Tobias felt his house shudder. He described it later to Clara Osborne, who recorded his words in another letter to her sister, as a vibration, not a blow. The house did not resist the wind, it let the wind pass, like water around a stone in a river. The stone does not fight the river. It simply remains. The curved stave walls deflected the wind smoothly. There was no flat surface for the air to press against, no corner where opposing pressure zones could develop the torsional forces that twist rectangular buildings apart. The conical roof, after presenting its sloped surface at 30 degrees to the screaming horizontal wind, created an aerodynamic profile that generated minimal uplift. The wind accelerated over the smooth cone and departed on the leeward side without the turbulent separation that tears flat or gabled roofs from their frames. The iron hoops, which compressed the stave walls into a unified cylinder, distributed the wind load continuously around the entire circumference, rather than concentrating it at corners and joints. On every stave bore a fraction of the total force. No single point exceeded its capacity. The ring beam held the rafters against uplift, and the rafters, radiating from the central hub, transferred the roof loads uniformly to the walls, which transferred them uniformly to the foundation, which transferred them uniformly to the earth. The mathematics worked. Every calculation in the German engineering text, every principle learned in the Cooperage in Stuttgart, and every observation recorded in 1,100 days of wind measurements in the leather notebook, all of it converged in the 3 minutes that the tornado's edge winds battered the roundhouse with forces that had obliterated every rectangular structure within half a mile. When it was over, when the roar subsided and the air pressure equalized and the debris began to settle from the sky like grotesque snow, Tobias opened his door and stepped outside. His house was undamaged. Not a shingle had lifted. Not a stave had shifted. The glass in both windows was intact. The iron hoops had not deformed. The door, which he had braced from the inside with a timber bar across iron brackets, the only concession he had made to the possibility of failure, swung open freely on its hinges. He walked around the exterior of the structure, running his hand along the curved wall, feeling for any displacement, any crack, any sign that the forces had found a weakness. There was none. 90 minutes later, Rudolf Fendt climbed out of his cellar into the ruins of what had been the finest house in Eldridge, Kansas. He stood among the scattered timbers and broken glass and the exposed floor joists of his vanished second story, and he looked north, and he could see, sitting on its rise a quarter-mile away, the roundhouse, untouched, intact, the stovepipe still rising from the center of the conical roof, a thin line of smoke still curling from it, because the fire inside had never gone out. De Fendt walked to Tobias's property the next morning. He brought nothing with him, no tools, no lumber, no offer of help, because there was nothing to help with. He stood in front of the roundhouse for a long time, and then he said, "I would like you to teach me how to build one of these." Tobias said, "You will need a draw knife." Fendt said, "I will get one." Over the following weeks, as Eldridge began the slow process of rebuilding, a process that the Eureka Herald covered extensively, but noting the near-miraculous survival of the German Cooper's peculiar dwelling, Tobias found himself receiving visitors he had not expected. Heinrich Drucker, who had lost everything for the second time in 3 years, came first. He had nothing to offer except labor, and Tobias accepted it, beginning to teach Drucker the principles of stave construction in the same patient, methodical manner in which he had been taught coopering 2 decades earlier in Stuttgart. Carswell came next, not to learn how to build a roundhouse, but to ask Tobias whether the same principles might be applied to reinforce his store, which had survived the tornado with moderate damage. The southwestern corner had been pushed 3 inches off its foundation, and the roof tin had peeled back for the 3rd time. Tobias examined the store and proposed a modification. Remove the right-angle corner bracing on the southwestern corner and replace it with a curved buttress, a quarter circle of stave-built wall, of 4 feet in radius that would convert the vulnerable 90-degree corner into a smooth curve, allowing wind from the prevailing direction to flow around it rather than impacting it directly. The modification cost $8.50 in materials and took 3 days to install. Carswell's store survived every subsequent storm without corner damage for the next 19 years until it was demolished in 1903 to make way for a brick building. But if this story is new to you, if you've never heard of stave-built houses or the application of coopering principles to wind-resistant architecture, I want you to know that you're not alone. These innovations were so thoroughly absorbed into the local building practices of central Kansas that their origin was forgotten within a generation. Subscribing to this channel is one way to ensure that the next forgotten innovation gets the attention it deserves. Well, these stories exist in courthouse archives and county newspapers and the letters of school teachers, and they surface only when someone goes looking. I go looking. Clara Osborne, who had been the first to describe the house as feeling like the inside of a musical instrument, documented the aftermath of the June 12th tornado in a series of letters that survive in the archives of the Massachusetts Historical Society, where they were deposited by her great-niece in 1954. The letters describe the rebuilding effort in detail and note that by the autumn of 1884, 3 new structures in and around Eldridge incorporated curved wall elements, not full circles in most cases, but curved corners, rounded buttresses, and in one case, a semicircular addition to an existing rectangular farmhouse that served as both windbreak and summer kitchen. The builder of that addition was Heinrich Drucker, and who had spent 3 months learning stave construction from Tobias, and who applied the technique to create a curved wall that shielded the western face of his new claim, shanty, from the prevailing wind. The shanty itself was still rectangular. Drucker could not bring himself to build a fully round house, for reasons he explained to Tobias with characteristic bluntness. "My wife will not live in a barrel. She has said so, but she will live behind a wall that keeps the wind from blowing in her door, and if that wall is curved, she will not complain." Tobias accepted this compromise with what Clara Osborne described as a small nod, which I have learned is his way of acknowledging that the world will take as much wisdom as it can use and no more. By 1886, at least 7 structures in Greenwood County incorporated curved wall elements directly traceable to Tobias's design principles. By 1890, the number had grown to an estimated 15 to 20, though precise counting is complicated by the fact that many of the modifications were small, a curved corner here, a rounded entryway there, and were not recorded in any formal way. The builders who adopted these techniques did not credit Tobias, not out of malice, but because the techniques had become, in the way of practical knowledge on the frontier, simply how you build to keep the wind out. The origin was irrelevant. The function was everything. Tobias Krenn lived in his roundhouse until 1901, when he sold the property and moved to Wichita to be near a niece who had emigrated from Germany the previous year. He was 62 years old. He had lived in the roundhouse for 20 years and had recorded over 7,300 daily weather observations in a series of leather notebooks that filled an entire shelf of his circular interior wall. He sold the house and its 40-acre parcel for $425, a significant appreciation over his construction cost. Even though a local real estate agent noted that the unusual shape of the dwelling may have limited the pool of interested buyers. The house survived another 23 years under subsequent owners, none of whom understood its engineering principles well enough to maintain them. The iron hoops, which required periodic tightening as the oak staves aged and shrank, were neglected. By 1910, gaps had opened between the staves wide enough to admit rain and insects. The pine tar and beeswax roof sealant was never renewed. The cedar shingles, which had a functional lifespan of approximately 25 years, began to fail around 1906. The house was eventually abandoned around 1918 and was dismantled for salvage lumber in 1924. A photograph, taken in 1919, discovered in 2003 in the files of the Greenwood County Historical Society, shows the structure still standing but visibly deteriorated. Gaps between the staves. See missing shingles on the northern slope of the conical roof, the door frame slightly displaced. Even in its decline, the basic form was intact. The cylinder stood. The cone sat atop it, unbroken. The iron hoops, though loose, still held the staves in their circle. Tobias died in Wichita on March 3, 1908, at the age of 69. His obituary in the Wichita Eagle was 4 lines long and identified him as a retired carpenter, formerly of Greenwood County. It did not mention the round house. It did not mention coopering, or wind resistance, or the tornado of June 12, 1884. It did not mention the leather notebooks filled with 27 years of daily weather observations, notebooks that were disposed of by his niece after his death, and which, if they survived, have never been located. What the obituary could not mention, because it was invisible by then, was the principle Tobias had proven. Or not the specific principle of cylindrical wind resistance that had been known in engineering circles for centuries and would be formally codified in aerodynamic research by the early 20th century. What Tobias proved was something more fundamental, that practical knowledge, carried across an ocean in the hands and mind of a craftsman, could solve problems that the accumulated conventional wisdom of an entire community could not. He did not invent the circle, he applied it. And he did not discover that wind flows around curves. He built a house that demonstrated it in a place where the demonstration was a matter of life and death, to an audience that had no interest in theory and absolute interest in survival. And the house stood. Today, the principles Tobias Krenn applied through coopering intuition and a battered German engineering text are standard elements of wind-resistant design. The Federal Emergency Management Agency's guidelines for tornado-resistant construction explicitly recommend curved wall profiles and aerodynamic roof shapes to reduce wind loading. Modern monolithic dome homes, concrete structures built on a circular footprint with a curved roof profile, can withstand winds exceeding 250 miles per hour and are rated for the most severe tornado category. The engineering behind these recommendations is sophisticated, are involving computational fluid dynamics and finite element analysis and wind tunnel testing that would have been incomprehensible to a Cooper from Stuttgart. But the core insight is the same one Tobias carried in his leather satchel. A curved surface deflects force that a flat surface must absorb. A continuous structure distributes load that a jointed structure concentrates. Compression holds what nails and bracing merely resist. In Eldridge, Kansas, in 1884, a man who understood barrels built a house that survived a tornado while every rectangular structure around it was destroyed. His neighbors stopped laughing and started measuring. Some of them curved their corners, some of them rounded their walls, none of them built a full circle, because convention is a gravity of its own, and it takes more than one demonstration to escape it entirely. But the walls they built lasted longer than the walls they would have built, and the roofs they shaped stayed on through storms that would have taken them, and the families inside those walls survived winters and springs and the screaming June afternoons when the sky turned green and the wind came looking for corners to pry apart and flat surfaces to push over and ridges to grab and lift and throw. It found fewer of them in Greenwood County after 1884. That was Tobias Krenn's legacy. Unwritten in any obituary, unrecorded in any archive, you're preserved only in the shape of the walls that stood when the square ones fell. The mathematics were never wrong. The wind does not care about tradition. It cares about geometry. And geometry, on the high plains of Kansas in the years when the country was still being built by hand, was the difference between a house that stood and a house that became a field of scattered lumber and broken glass and memories of a parlor rug ruined by rain through shattered windows. Tobias knew this, and he had always known it. He was a Cooper. He understood curves, and curves, when the wind comes, are not a peculiarity or an eccentricity or the symptom of a disordered mind. They are the only shape that answers the wind in its own language, smooth, continuous, without resistance, without apology, without corners. The round house stood because it had no argument with the wind. It simply let the wind pass, the way a stone lets the river pass, and remained.